Hello. So do we have Courtenay Cleary on?
Hi, yes.
Great. So this
How are you?
great. This is I'm calling you from Australia. Where are you in Australia?
Yeah, I'm in Brisbane at the moment,
Yeah, in
so
Brisbane.
East Coast.
Oh, cool. Well, it's just exciting to be able to do this. I've talked to some other artists around the world previously from Tokyo and the Netherlands, so it's great to be able to
Oh, wow.
use
Yeah,
this.
cool.
You're the second classical musician to be on the program. We actually a couple months ago we talked to a classical harpist named
Oh, nice.
Doreen Marseille from the Netherlands. So
Oh, great.
we're
Cool.
always trying to increase all the types of musicians that we talk to.
Uh-huh.
So I sent you the questions, but I was looking over your background, and I just wanted to kind of point out. Because of the coronavirus, are you still doing your scholarship at Juilliard? Or are you?
Yeah, so actually I graduated from Juilliard in May, so I actually had to have my graduation ceremony and my recital in my living room at home here. So, yeah, I mean, the scholarships and everything, they were for the duration of the degree, but I've actually just finished it. So,
Well, that's cool.
yeah.
Because I was wondering how that worked out because of the coronavirus, if there were any updates to that.
Yes, so I had to leave New York in about March. So the last sort of semester was all online for me.
And then the other thing that's really kind of notable is like in 2017, you played for the Queen.
I did, yes.
At Westminster Abbey, and that's pretty big.
Yeah, it was, yeah, I mean, that led to a lot of other opportunities. It was great to be broadcast on the BBC. And then I got to play for her again the following year for the Commonwealth
In
Heads of Government
2018,
meeting. Yeah,
at
so
Buckingham Palace.
that was
So
very cool.
no, I think that as the type of musician you are, that's a big gig. I'm always talking to indie rock bands and alternative rock bands, and they think they've made it if they play like Radio City or they play the Viper Room or CBGBs or something. But in your world, playing places like that is a totally different type of set.
Yeah,
Like
I mean, it's a little bit
Lincoln
different for
Center.
us with those huge venues because often acoustic instruments won't suit those big pop venues. But yeah, for us, Westminster Abbey and Buckingham Palace, yeah, definitely good venues for us.
Yeah, and the Lincoln Center too. I see that you've done that.
Yes, of course, because Juilliard is sort of right next to it, so we have a lot of concerts there.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of get back to our standard questions that we always talk to musicians. We typically our broadcast is 90% musicians, and then we talk to other creative type people. But we always ask the question, when did you first get into music and what age? And what drew you to classical instruments in this age of like so many people who are musicians aren't really making that choice? What drew you to classical music and the violin?
Yeah, so basically, my mum is a professional clarinet player. She was in the Australian contemporary ensemble called Perihelion. They have a lot of albums if you want to go check them out. But basically, I grew up sitting on the floor of her rehearsals, and I pointed at the viola player and I said, I want to play that. And of course, my mum got me a violin. And I was about 3 years old, so I started lessons, from the age of 3 and then continued all through school. There hasn't really been a point in my life where I've wanted to do anything else. So, yeah, that's kind of how it all started.
I started as a clarinet player, but as somebody wanted to be a singer songwriter, or I tended to. Well, clarinet's not really a good writing instrument.
Yeah.
So I switched to like pianos and organs and keyboards.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah. So that's interesting. So you've been on that track at a very young age.
Yes.
And well, I'm hearing a little keyboard clicking or something.
Yeah, no, I'm not typing. There's just a bit of a sound on the line. I think it's just like a crackling sound.
Yeah, it sometimes happens on international stuff for some reason.
Yeah, I'm not actually typing anything, but I can hear that as well. Actually, it seems to have maybe stopped a little bit.
Yeah, it kind of goes and let me see if I get some that fixes it. No, yeah, I think it's the signal sometimes. So you've been in that classical zone in terms of working with orchestras and doing solo work in quartets.
Yeah.
So what's your, you knew you had a talent for the instrument, or did you have to really, you selected the violin, but did you ever make a choice to like change instruments, or you just always stuck with the violin?
It's always been violin. I did do a bit of piano in high school, and I was pretty good at it, but it gets to a point where you don't have a lot of time to practice both. To be really good at one instrument, you sort of have to be putting in loads of hours, and I chose to keep going with violin and not piano at that point. Interestingly, at Juilliard, they do make every grad student, I think, and undergraduate student as well, play piano for 4 semesters, or depending on your level to begin with. But 4
Is
years
that just
piano.
about is that just about learning music theory and learning composition? Is that part of that?
Yeah, so basically it's for score reading, being able to learn different clefs, and learning piano is the best way to do that. So they make you do that. I was pretty terrible at it because I hadn't played the piano for a long time, since probably my second last year of high school. So yes, it was a little refresher for me.
So that's interesting, yeah, because like piano is kind of like, it's like a writing instrument. It's more for like guys who are writing. Songwriters love acoustic guitars and pianos.
Mm-hmm.
It gives you like the full breadth of what you need to do.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, it's just interesting. Like if you're on a clarinet or you're on a violin, you don't have to know that bass part.
I mean,
as much.
yes,
I mean,
no,
both.
Yes, no.
Maybe you do.
Yeah, I would argue that you definitely do, particularly if you're going to play with an orchestra, or even things like solo Bach that don't have any accompaniment. It's really important, if you're learning phrasing and you're making an overall artistic vision for a piece, that you do have that underlying harmonic knowledge. So it's much easier to build a phrase and then sort of have this musical scope if you have that harmonic understanding. Even when I've been studying Bach, teachers will often make you play a bass line along to the Bach partita or the sonata. So it is actually really important.
Yeah, that's why I kind of switched from clarinet to piano in the first place.
Yeah, it's definitely, it gives you that harmonic understanding.
So in your training that you went through at Juilliard, what was your focus, just to become the best violinist, or did you want to get into a broader arranging and songwriting and conducting? What's the direction did you want to go?
Yeah, so I mean, my degree was in just violin performance, and there are a lot of incredible violinists at Juilliard. They can play very loudly and very quickly. They can play very impressive repertoire. But for me, I do like to have a broader array of musical abilities, not so much in songwriting and composition, but more in the sense that I really enjoy contemporary music and collaborating with composers and other musicians and new music. I mean, we have conservatoires, we're conserving old music, but at the same time, I think new music is really important. So I'm actually in the process of a PhD application, and it's about a collaborative compositional process.
Because that's the last classical musician I talked to was a harpist from the Netherlands, and she was very much into going and working with not people within the classical genre. She was working with other genres like electronica and pop and rock bands, and it was interesting.
Yeah, that's really cool.
That I keep on running into more. I mean, I've run into maybe 4 people I've interviewed in the last couple months. There are classical musicians that have been integrating classical genre with other musical genres, which is really cool. Because I saw you on Instagram, and I was wondering, okay, how many classical musicians are going to be on Instagram? So are you actually trying to maybe navigate that to get into a wider area? And it seems like you are.
Yeah, definitely.
So did you find any resistance in the way that you are, the people that you work with in your genre? Are they purist? Like folk musicians tend to be very pure, and they like, I don't want to hear any electric guitar at all. They just want to stick to playing traditional folk or Americana, and if you try to do something else, then they'll kind of yell at you like they did yelled at Bob Dylan back in the 60s.
Yeah, look, a lot of classical musicians are really purist and they don't want to know about contemporary music. They get a little bit afraid of atonality. I think they're afraid of change, which is kind of stopping progress for the sake of progress. Like it seems a little counterintuitive to me, and this is why classical music is a dying art form, because people think it's this really elitist art form, but it doesn't have to be that way. It can be accessible and it can be progressive, and it can it can be a lot of things. We can still use classical instruments to play contemporary music, and I think people need to approach contemporary music with a bit more of an open mind, and instead of listening to it with what they're expecting it to sound like, just listen to it for what it is, and then maybe you'll have a better appreciation.
Yeah. Well, I've always been into experimentation. I'm a big devotee of progressive electronic music or progressive rock. And, so I was into Sun Ra because Sun Ra was one of the first, American jazz bands to use a mode. And that was kind of really radical to use a synthesizer in jazz. And in the late 50s, they were one of the first bands to do it. And that always inspired me. And I'm a heavy synthesizer user to the point of like analog synth, which is my own thing. But the idea of it is like the experimentation that's being done with modular synths and analog and, all kinds of interesting electronic capabilities. Different genres come to people in my genre looking for collaboration.
I'm so sorry. Somebody's just knocked on my front door.
Oh, okay.
Oh no, it's just a delivery. So sorry, they've left now. They've just dropped something off.
But it's just interesting. I think this kind of today's music seems to be a lot of experimentation and cross genre. So it's interesting to hear that within your genre, there's a lot of people. I guess like I've seen it even within rock. There's a traditional American rock band, and they don't want to go beyond, Tom Petty or Led Zeppelin. And then you see where that's going. It's not really going anywhere.
Right. And the other thing with classical contemporary music, I think a lot of musicians are afraid of it because it's really hard. If a composer writes a really complex rhythm or something that isn't easy to hear in your ear before you have to play it, people find that really challenging, and they don't want to take that on. They want to play it safe in the tonal and rhythmic departments.
So as a performance oriented musician, your goal now you're going for your PhD, and you're talking about mixing genres. So your long range goal is to maybe work on full compositions as a writer, or to be more of a performer.
Definitely more on the performance side. So the PhD will be collaborating with already established composers. But what I found a lot of the time is if I receive a new piece, there are some things that don't work so well for the instrument or for me as a performer, or, things that could have been better from the beginning if, the performer was involved from the very first steps. So the PhD will be examining that collaborative process and discovering what it can be better in a composition, and if that the performance and recording outcomes benefit from that collaboration.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I talk to bands, a lot of times musicians, they might not be like the writer of the song, but like if you're like a bass player and you have a guy with a piano player and he gives you the song, right? The bass player tends to change that part because that's their instrument. And so do you find that in your genre as the classical, if you're given a written piece of music, but you find a better way to do it, are you allowed to kind of rewrite it, or you have to play it exactly as you get it?
Usually you're meant to play it exactly as you get it, especially with old music. You wouldn't dare change something in a Beethoven or a Brahms sonata. But generally with living composers, you can email them and say, oh, I'm not sure what you meant by this, or I think it would be a little better. I mean, if they're a really famous composer, you probably wouldn't tell them they need to correct their own piece. But with my composer friends, it's definitely great to, call them and say, oh, I think it'd be really cool if we change this part, an octave higher, or we change that technique. So it's a really interesting process.
Yeah, so I guess if you're playing a traditional piece, Bach, Beethoven, Chopin, you're playing something like that, you got like the heart of it. I guess I'm trying to understand when the conductor takes a piece, they take liberties with it, I guess, to a certain degree in terms of the feel. So does that kind of translate to they're still kind of directing all the musicians though?
Yeah, so
for
their job is to
interpretation.
interpret. Yeah, they're interpreting the score as they think the composer would have wanted it, or they're bringing that emotional element. Because a lot of the time, certain harmonies change in an orchestral score, and they do need time to register. And if you give time and space to those, it can be a really meaningful and emotional performance, and the conductor can facilitate that really well. But in terms of notation, I've never experienced a conductor change anything.
Okay, so it's more the spacing of the notes, but not changing the note.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so it's kind of giving it a little like even in the mix with electronic music, sometimes we don't do as many overdubs
Right.
to kind of leave a very sparse kind of like Prince, very kind of sparse composition.
Yeah,
but might not put a bass line in, right, to leave a drum machine and leave it sounding like a demo, just because you want to have that space between the notes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a bit like how you also might add envelopes and different textures and that kind of thing. The conductor
play with your filter, like a low pass filter or a high pass filter.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Play with the tactic sustain, release, or use a random voltage generator.
Yeah, so we can do all of those things on our instruments, and the conductor can indicate where we need to do those things.
So that's interesting because there are some aspects of classical music, that synthesis, that we try to replicate.
Mm-hmm.
We're always trying to replicate big orchestral sounds.
Yeah.
On our synths, we get these big polyphonic or unlimited polyphony synthesizers that allow us to take like a Steinway or like an old German piano, or try to sample a really good violin from a certain year to get that sound, but we're trying to recreate it rather than actually like having a musician play it. We're trying to think about how would I play that on a synthesizer or a MIDI controller. And I'm not a violinist, so I'm trying to get that feel. Because I'm always trying to imitate another instrument.
Yeah, I think it's cool to do that when it clearly sounds like it's supposed to sound synthesized. But a lot of the time I hear fake violins, in TV soundtracks. And I'm like, couldn't you have just gotten a violinist?
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to do more like Keith Emerson, or like stuff like that. Stuff like or Tangerine Dream, bands like that. Guys like Sunrod Davis.
No, I think that sounds really cool. Yeah,
that's the stuff I'm kind of getting at. But
definitely.
have you ever thought of collaborating with jazz band or progressive jazz or like fusion bands, or is that like outside your zone?
Jazz, I love jazz. I always have jazz music on in my home, but the level to which they improvise and are so intuitive, it just frightens me a little bit. A friend of mine, Jason, who's a brilliant pianist, we used to improvise a lot together, but without anybody listening, and it's a whole different ball game if you're going to do that in front of an audience or record it. And I don't really have that much experience with doing it. I mean, I wish I could play like Yehudi Menuhin and Django Reinhardt, and but no, it's not really my area of expertise, unfortunately.
They just because the rigor of always following the written performance of the classical kind of genre kind of has you locked in a little bit to that.
Yeah, I mean, with what I do, there isn't a whole lot of improvisation. It's usually just written out, and anything that is improvised is usually for recordings, layered, and it's more soundscapes and that kind of thing for effects. Later on, it's not.
Later on, you can do that, but the main melody is always kind of pre-controlled. Yeah, I mean that's interesting because a lot of I'm a big blues guy. I'm into the blues and jazz. And that it's always been somewhat within the African American tradition, it's kind of this kind of feel based music. Funk and fusion are all kind of feel based. They have like technical roots about how you should do it, but then there's a lot of freedom. So where you're gonna go, and that's always appealed to me as a musician. That's kind of improvisational musicians. But it's interesting that you kind of felt a little fear in that.
Yeah, no, it's because I haven't done it from an early age. I think I'm so comfortable with my current genre because I've just done it for 24 years. But yeah, improv is quite new to me. So who knows? Maybe in another 20 years I'll be comfortable with that.
That's interesting because a lot of people would think that classical musicians are such that you have such capability. You can sight read, that you have a really high technical capability on your instruments. I guess some people assume that you're comfortable just playing.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I know a lot of classical musicians who aren't comfortable doing that as well. So, yeah,
that's really cool. The one is cool, but I mean, but it's an interesting thing to think about because it's like there's perception and reality. It's like if you look at like a studio musician that can sight read. You know, if you get a regular rock band, a lot of them are just reading charts. You know, they can't fully sight read. But if you get a full studio musician working for like Motown or Stax or something, they can read everything.
Yeah, my sight reading game, not gonna lie, it's pretty strong. But charts, not so much. If you give me the chords, then yeah, I can work within that. But yeah, notes, I can sight read no problem.
Yeah, a lot of bands are kind of feel or charts. You know, it's kind of it's all that. But then they get a little intimidated when they find somebody who can fully sight read. Because they're like, well, because I can't really, you know, they're gonna like, well, just show me it, and they can pick it up. You know, a lot of musicians I deal with, you know, if you play them something, they'll pick it up and they'll hear it, and they can immediately play by ear, immediately kind of feel into the groove and pick it up. But it's always interesting to get a little intimidated in the opposite way that you are. In if somebody's home to sight reader, it's like, oh, well, I can't really do that.
Yeah, exactly.
So you always wonder like where somebody's strength in some cases is you know not exactly what you thought it was. So in terms of your influences and reference points, who are your favorite musical influences and reference points in your music? I guess because you don't write as much of your own music, but who are your primary influences?
Well, in terms of other violinists, definitely Perlman. He's a classic. I've loved him since I was a little kid. I also really love Hilary Hahn. A lot of people think she's really boring, but I actually just think people aren't listening hard enough to her nuance, and her precision is just incredible. But in terms of other artists, I mean, it's a bit of a guilty pleasure, but I'm really obsessed with Ariana Grande. Honestly, she is an incredible singer, and her intonation, I've been to her concerts twice now, and I don't know how she manages to sing so perfectly in tune. It's really, really impressive.
So you're impressed with her voice?
Yeah, her voice is incredible, and just her technique, and just, you know, the way she's able to display that virtuosity in pop music, and, you know, she just does what she wants, and people love it, and I really admire that in a musical sense. And I try to sort of channel that in my own output in terms of contemporary music. You know, I record something and, you know, maybe people won't like this, but this is what I wanted to do today, so I'm putting that out there.
That's fantastic. So do you find that you're drawn to vocalists as inspiration, as a you know, violinist? Are you listening to that melody and the vocal to kind of be inspired?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a lot of the time we play a really melodic line, and I think, how would a singer sing this? You know, it's going to be smooth, it's going to be soaring and lyrical, whereas a lot of the time we let violin technique get in the way of that melodic line. So I try to keep the phrase as lyrical as possible. So definitely, yeah.
That's interesting that you, as a musician, you would kind of key in on the vocal. Yeah. That's the thing. Well, I've heard, you know, what saxophone players in jazz bands or fusion bands, they tend to kind of follow like a vocal style to kind of represent what they're doing. And I've seen guitar players actually emulate saxophone players.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. I've seen that before. That's really cool.
Yeah, well, Hendrix was kind of famous for trying to mimic Coltrane. You know,
Yeah.
in some ways, if you listen to Hendrix, you can kind of hear where he's doing some of his style is influenced by jazz saxophone phrasing. And you're like, well, that's why it sounds so different, because it's not what a typical guitar player would do. But he's trying to actually emulate a horn.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Or wind, which gives it a totally different feel than any other rock you'd ever hear. And it's like, why is it going that way? Also, because he was left-handed and using his thumb to do chords and notes at the same time, which was a different style that people try to do. But yeah, it's always interesting to hear where musicians, you know, get their inspiration from, and how they process it into their own work.
Yeah, no, that's really cool.
So I guess, like, are you writing a lot of your own stuff now? Or you're primarily a performance. You always take a lot of work from other writers, but do you actually sit down and write anything of your own work?
No, I'm not a composer. I mean, I've attempted composition in the past, but I'll get, 10 bars into a composition and think, oh, I've heard that somewhere before, and I've just like subconsciously stolen it from somewhere. So no, I'm primarily a performer. I play other people's music and collaborate with them. So
that's your focus, is trying to to broaden your collaboration to not just be within the classical genre, to work with other people and bring your performance capabilities to people's work.
Yeah, that's definitely my aim and what I've been doing mostly for the last few years. So yeah.
So under the coronavirus, based in this time, how have you been able to, collaborate or work on people's work? Do you have the capability at home, if you're given a piece of music, to put it down, or you have to go to a studio to do that?
I mean, generally at this stage, if I'm collaborating on a composition, it won't be in the stage yet where I want to record it. So it is definitely possible to collaborate, via email, by phone. I've had a lot of Zoom conversations with people. The first part of coronavirus, obviously, was just spent finishing off my master's for Juilliard, but I did actually have to record some contemporary music for various Juilliard projects. Now, yeah, it is really, really hard without the performances and that opportunity to sort of present ideas, even just to a small audience in your home. It's still really difficult, but yeah, I have tried my best to keep the music going during Corona.
So, as a classical musician, I'm assuming you use like microphones and maybe a DAW to record it, or if you're working at home, how do you work? Like a typical rock band would use like Pro Tools or FL Studio and use their Mac, and have a bunch of microphones tied to a MIDI interface device. But what would a classical musician? I would assume you'd have to mic things, like a drummer has to mic drums.
So I have a pretty good microphone. It's a Zoom H6.
Okay, I know what that is.
Yeah, it's actually really great for violin concerts. If I'm doing a recording of a concert at home, which is what I've been doing recently, I put the Zoom kind of far away in the room. Violins tend to sound a bit better further away rather than up close, because you get a lot of extraneous noise, like the bow on the string, some scratchy sounds that aren't really contributing to the overall aesthetic. So that's been really good. I also have 2 DSLR Canon cameras, which I use for the video recording, and then I splice that together later. In terms of sound, I don't edit a lot. Usually if the room is really dry, I might add a little reverb, or conversely, if I've been recording in a church and it's really resonant, I'll have to dial that back, just so that you can hear everything clearly. But yeah, that's been working pretty well at the moment. I do have Ableton, but I'm terrible at using it. So yeah, but it's not often that I do splice recordings myself. Like if I'm going to do a commercial recording, there'll be an engineer that does that.
So you just do it on your Zoom and then give them the WAV file, and then they'll do the recording engineer will just figure out how to put it in.
Yeah. I mean, if I'm doing a video, I can put it together myself for a lot of assessments and auditions and stuff, you can't edit. It's against the rules.
Okay, you gotta do it just straight.
Yeah, so just one take. So I'm used to having to nail it in one go.
That's kind of cool because I'm kind of a big proponent of kind of old school recording. I don't use a DAW. I use hardware recorders. Because I have like analog synths, and my whole point is if I take something in the main stage or Ableton, then I tend to go back and try to fix it. And I'm more of a kind of guy. I'd rather be more spontaneous and just get it right and just have that feeling at that moment.
Yeah,
and
definitely. I mean,
with analog synths, they're kind of like acoustic instruments. So you want to capture a point in time, and that's what it is at that point. And I'd rather not go and try to futz with it. I'd rather just like put it down, and then so it's somewhat similar to what you're doing.
Yeah, that's why we're performers. People want to come and see what you did in that moment rather than perfecting every little tiny aspect.
So what do you think about that in the music industry? There's so many modern musicians that spend, I would say that there's a lot of musicians that maybe are more producers than musicians, that they spend so much time on the grid within Ableton or Pro Tools that I don't know if they're at the musical capability of what the musicians were doing in the 70s and the 80s, just because they had to go to a studio and put it down. Yeah. And now they don't spend as much time trying to put it down as they're perfecting the studio craft.
Yeah, so I mean, performing and recording are very different mediums, and I think they're both fantastic. Like, I love recording because you can convey your art to the audience exactly how you had imagined it. I think it's quite an underestimated medium in that sense. I don't think people quite appreciate how many times people might do one little thing to get it exactly how they wanted it. But at the same time, I think people have to realize, I mean, it's a bit like seeing Photoshop in magazines. People have to realize that it's, it's not fabricated, so to speak, but it's, it's been edited and it's, perfect.
Well, it kind of even goes back to George Martin. I saw a documentary called Produced by George Martin. And he had a statement about the Beatles. He said what he wanted to bring to the Beatles was this idea that I'm not just going to record the band like they were playing live in Berlin. I'm actually going to interpret the music like a painter interprets their painting, right? So I'm not just going to do a photo of exactly the way nature looks. I'm going to interpret nature. Well, he said he was going to interpret what John, Paul, Ringo, and the guys were doing, and actually do it more like a sound painting, which means you're going to use the studio to enhance that reality and make that sound like more than what it could be in the real world.
Yeah, definitely. So sometimes when I collaborate with composers, I mean, I briefly mentioned it before, but recording extended techniques to do things like soundscapes and textural effects and that kind of thing. So I think that's really, really cool, and that's not utilized enough in creative recording. A lot of people just record exactly what's on the page, and yeah, we should do that with old music. But I think that's definitely a medium we can utilize more in terms of contemporary composition is recording and interpreting sounds and then manipulating them to, create new sound worlds that we haven't necessarily heard before.
Yeah, it's like the idea like found sounds or granular synthesis is a big new thing in synthesis, where we do a field recording, bring it into a granular synthesizer, and you could say you could break a glass, capture it as a sample, bring it into a granular synthesizer, and then actually play it polyphonically on the whole 61 key bed. And so you could take that sound from nature and actually play it as a chord. Yeah. And then manipulate it. And so then you create whole new tones out of just field recordings.
Yeah, I think that's
that you can actually manipulate on a synthesizer.
Yeah.
And then you create a whole new reality.
Yeah.
But it seems like you're thinking of, it seems like in your future things that you're going to work on and collaborating with, you seem to be open to that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really useful and really exciting. People are used to hearing a violin, but how else can we use the violin to make new sounds?
Yeah, like if you ran your violin through an ARP 2600 envelope follower, and
Mm.
use the random voltage generator like Pete Townsend did on Who Are You. He actually took his guitar on the song Who Are You, and he ran it through an ARP 2600 through the envelope follower and the random voltage generator, and people think it's a synthesizer, but it's actually his guitar going through an ARP 2600.
Yeah, nice. I mean, we've seen composers doing that kind of thing even in the 80s. It was widely rejected, but Boulez, even in On Tem 2, which is a solo violin piece, there were a lot of electronics, and they were run through like harmonization filters, delays, and all that kind of stuff. So you can check that piece out. It's really cool.
Yeah, I think that's what I think. Well, I think anytime you experiment and you take your signal and you run it through another capability, you know, like a lot of times I'll sample, my own songs and then run them in what they call like time shifting samplers, where you can take like the first note and merge it with the note in the middle of the piece with the note in the end of the piece, and you can kind of fold time and put them on top of each other. And when you do stuff like that, you get all these, harmonics and things that you never would have thought you could get. And you play with the subharmonics, and you play with the, the polyrhythms, and that's how you get to like more complicated, not obvious things that you could do in music.
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully we'll see some of that in my recordings coming up as part of this PhD.
Do you guys, does polyrhythmic concepts, is that something that's in classical music?
Yeah, definitely. I mean,
how would you kind of describe like a polyrhythmic piece?
Polyrhythmic, I mean, so that sort of stems from cross-rhythmic elements. So we've seen that as early as Brahms. He and Beethoven really coined the 3 against 2 to begin with. So you've got 3 in one part and 2 in the other, and it has to line up together. But yeah, we see that a lot and in phasing. So something might even take, 5 to 10 bars to line up again if you've got 5s against 7s. And at Juilliard in rhythmic training, they often make us, count or conduct in one time signature and then have to say the polyrhythms over the top. So dividing that into 7, 10, whatever. So yeah, that's definitely something we see a lot, particularly in contemporary music, to achieve certain rhythms and rhythmic elements. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been using like a mode called subharmonicon, which actually that whole instrument, all it does is polyrhythms and subharmonics.
Okay.
That's what its whole claim to fame is. That's what it's designed to do. but it kind of forces you to think in that way because that's how it operates.
That's
It has
cool that they
have multiple polyrhythmic sequencers that can run polyrhythms like at the same time. And you can adjust the time, and you can adjust the subharmonics of all the oscillators. So you have like 6 oscillators and sub-oscillators. You can adjust the subharmonics, and then you can adjust the polyrhythms all at once. And then you can kind of hit or miss where you're going with it.
Yeah,
it's all kind of feel based. It's kind of a thing where it's like kind of what you hear is what you get. So you kind of play with the dial controls with an understanding of what it's going to do, and then you kind of listen to where we get that sweet spot where you say, "Oh, I got something."
Yeah, nice. Yeah, it's all about experimentation and finding what sounds good and what's new, and what works for you, really.
Yeah, it's kind of like I'm probably not advanced enough to kind of know where I want to be. I kind of let the machine take me on a trip. But
yeah,
I do appreciate the guys who actually know where they're going before they even hit the dial.
Oh, totally. Yeah, it would take years to learn. I mean, it's basically like learning a new instrument, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like that seems to be a big thing now. People are wanting to get into more complicated things, like granular synthesis and subharmonics and polyrhythms. So you're not just taking a drum machine and running an 808 in the same beat over and over. That you try to do more complicated arrangements. But I think it's interesting. I'm always telling people, it's like classical music, you really should get, read up on music theory and jazz fusion theory. If you're trying to do experimental electronic music, you really kind of have to look to the past and the future at the same time.
Yep, definitely. I mean, we can always take inspiration for the past, but we're from the past, sorry, but we're always looking forward as well.
So, are you working on any big projects right now? Any collaborations that you can reveal that you're currently got going on for 2020 or 2021?
Yeah, so aside from this PhD, I mean, I have a few composers lined up. I still need to confirm those. But in terms of performances, I mean, everything is really up in the air because of COVID. But I do have 3 recitals coming up at the Queensland Performing Arts Centre in September. I've got a few concertos lined up, but they haven't been published yet, so I don't think I'm allowed to tell you what those are.
So is that like based on is that based on like COVID being under control, or they think they're going to be able to do it under like COVID restrictions?
Well, it's actually just for the next season, so they haven't published the season brochure yet.
Okay.
So hopefully by then, but by the time that season starts, I will be allowed to perform and there will be an audience there. Actually, I just did a really exciting collaboration with Tom Thumb. He's an electronic artist and beatboxer, and he raps as well. And actually, we realized that we live on the same street through Instagram. Totally crazy.
That's
so then
great.
I ended up going around to his place. He's got a studio there, and working on some solo violin stuff for an album he recorded with the Queensland Symphony Orchestra. So I think that's being released next month. So you can keep an eye out for that one.
Is that going to be like on all the streaming services?
Yeah, it should be. I think he's mostly, Spotify, Apple Music. I think so.
If when that comes out, give us a note and we can kind of like push it out.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll definitely be putting that on my Instagram. You can head to his Instagram too. It's Tom Thummer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's got quite a lot of followers, actually, I think 100,000. So
wow. So maybe I should talk to him, but maybe if he's got time, maybe we should interview him too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he's a really nice guy.
Well, that's cool that you're doing that. So you were just able to go over to his studio and just put some stuff down?
Yeah.
Did he write it out for you, or did you kind of just feel it out?
Yeah, so he was collaborating with a composer called Gordon Hamilton. So he's also Brisbane-based. He's been working with the Queensland Symphony Orchestra as well. And he was able to write those string lines that we then recorded over the top of the track. And they're going to mix that, layer it up, do some cool effects. So, yeah, really excited to hear it.
That's cool, because I was actually watching a documentary on Frank Zappa, and he had a vibraphone player that was like classically trained on some of his albums, like Apostrophe, and the interesting thing with him, he would actually conduct full string sections on his records, and he would actually write out all the sheet music. He was a full composer.
Mm-hmm.
So unlike most rock musicians, he would actually write out all the sheet music. And
yeah.
And I was in the documentary. They were showing how he was telling the vibraphone player to do everything, do the triads as just two note chords, which actually created like the Zappa sound on a vibraphone. Is the fact that everything, instead of being a triad, is actually like just a 2 ballot chord. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting that he thought, and he actually wrote it out that way. It wasn't like an accident. He actually knew what it would sound like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, composers have that experience with orchestration and know texturally what needs to happen to create those desired effects.
But the funny thing is, when they asked him how did he learn how to do composing, he said he just went to the library.
Yeah, well, I guess enough score study will teach you.
Which I don't know if he was just trying to underplay what he really had done.
Mm.
Which some guys will say, well, yeah, I just went to the library, but he might have actually done a little bit more than that. So are you doing anything like online, like unplugged performances because of coronavirus? Have you been invited to do any kind of online collaborations?
Yeah, so I've done a couple of online recitals. I actually did one on Tuesday for the Tait Memorial Trust. I've had ongoing collaborations with them for the last few years, especially when I was living in the UK. They're an Australian organisation that helps Australian artists, study in the UK and put on concerts and that kind of thing. So I think there will also be a delayed broadcast, or it's accessible later. If you want to see that concert, you can head to their website.
Cool.
And I think I'll probably have some coming up. I mean, they'll all be listed on my website, but none that I can think of at the moment. Yeah, it's all very sparse in terms of my workload at the moment.
So you're primarily focusing on your education and the collaborations that you are doing and your performance.
Yeah, so just working on getting that degree started. I mean, it sort of hasn't fully launched yet, but yeah, that's what I'm working on at the moment. And then just these recitals in September. That's next in my practice list.
Well, it's great to talk to another classical musician. We're always trying to bring different musicians' points of view and capabilities to our audience, because we don't think we should just focus on one type of music, because I'm an overall fan of like all music. So
yeah, me too.
So I just want to be able to give my audience every opportunity to hear any kind of music that's being played that's really interesting, and that I think people should know about. So I thought it would be interesting to have you on the show. So, Courtenay Cleary.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great to chat to you as well.
We're going to put this out on 11 podcast platforms. We are part of Spotify. Anchor FM is a Spotify company. So there'll be a Spotify version of this podcast, which will be linked to Instagram. And people will be able to hit the highlight on Instagram, and it'll go right to the Spotify version of the podcast. And we're also on Apple, Radio Public, Stitcher, Overcast, and many more.
Great. Well, great to talk to you, and thanks so much. And looking forward to listening back to it later.
Well, thank you. Have a good morning.
Perfect. Thank you. You too. Evening.
Okay, bye.
Evening for you. Bye.
Bye.